200 years ago, this was just a swamp between fields and a river. Today, every child on the planet knows this address. This is the White House, the entire story of America's most famous mansion, the White House. Sounds grand, doesn't it? But behind the beautiful facade lies a very different story. This house was not built by presidents, but by stonemasons, enslaved people and immigrants whose names almost no one remembers. It survived fire when British soldiers burned it down to the brick. It watched Lincoln pace through sleepless nights during the Civil War. It heard secret calls during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world stood one step away from nuclear war. Here, kings and dictators were received. Here it was decided who would go to war and who would come home. In official photos you see smiles and carpets. But underneath them are compromises, fears, and decisions that change the lives of millions. So what is the White House really? Just a beautiful mansion for presidents, or a silent witness to America's darkest secrets? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Before we can understand the White House itself, we first have to understand why anyone would choose to build America's capital in such an unlikely place. The reason, as in so many episodes of American history, comes down to compromise, political horse trading, and the messy reality of stitching together 13 quarreling states into a single nation. In the summer of 1790, the fate of America's future capital was effectively sealed, not by a grand master plan, but by a private dinner deal that later became legendary in the story of American politics. Alexander Hamilton, the ambitious Secretary of the Treasury, desperately needed support for his controversial financial program, a plan for the federal government to assume the Revolutionary War debts of the individual states. This proposal had become hopelessly deadlocked in Congress, with Southern representatives deeply suspicious of what they saw as a Northern grab for power and influence. Thomas Jefferson recently returned from France to serve as Secretary of State. He served as Secretary found himself in the role of unlikely broker. At a private dinner in his residence on Maiden Lane in New York City, Jefferson brought together Hamilton and James Madison, the influential congressman from Virginia. What unfolded over that meal became a founding bargain of American geography. Hamilton would secure enough Southern votes for his Assumption Plan, and in exchange, the permanent capital of the United States would be placed on the Potomac River, on territory carved from Maryland and Virginia, rooting the seat of government firmly in the South. This was no small concession. At the time, several established cities were competing fiercely for the honor of hosting the nation's capital. Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, all were functioning urban centers with usable infrastructure, established merchant elites, and the basic amenities of what people then called civilized life. The Potomac site, by contrast, was a stretch of tidal marshland, forest, and clay soil that flooded with disturbing regularity. In modern terms, the location was wildly impractical, as if today someone decided to build a new capital, not in an existing metropolitan area, but in a humid, mosquito-ridden bottomland, hours away from anywhere of real consequence. Yet this very remoteness appealed to some factions. Southern planters, including George Washington himself, owned significant property in the region and stood to profit handsomely from the land speculation that would almost certainly follow. At the same time, a capital built from nothing could be imagined as a pure symbol of Republican virtue, untouched by the commercial corruption that supposedly clung to older cities. In the minds of its advocates, it could become an American Rome, a planned city of broad avenues and classical monuments, rising out of the wilderness and embodying the democratic ideals of the new republic. So on July 16, 1790, President Washington signed the Residence Act into law, designating a federal district of 10 miles square along the Potomac River as the permanent seat of government. The temporary capital would remain in Philadelphia for roughly a decade while the new city took shape. Washington himself received extraordinary authority to choose the exact location within the designated area and to oversee the planning and construction of the federal buildings. What followed was something halfway between urban planning and wilderness taming, between soaring architectural ambition and the brutal reality of mud, disease, and distance. The United States was about to try to build a capital city almost from scratch in a place that nature had never intended for such grand purposes, and the White House would stand at the center of that risky experiment. The question now facing President Washington was not just where to place a few buildings, but how to create a capital that looked and felt worthy of a nation which saw itself as heir to classical Republican virtue. For that task, he turned to a man whose sense of scale matched the challenge, Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French-born military engineer who had served with distinction during the Revolutionary War. L'Enfant arrived at the Potomac site in March of 1791. In that waterlogged, uneven landscape, he saw not limitation but possibility. Where others noticed mud, standing water, and clouds of mosquitoes, L'Enfant imagined sweeping boulevards and long, dramatic vistas. The plan he presented to Washington that summer was audacious. A city designed not for the fragile young republic that existed in that moment, but for the powerful empire he believed it might one day become. At the core of L'Enfant's vision was a grid of streets overlaid with bold diagonal avenues radiating from key points, creating grand perspectives like those in Versailles or Baroque Rome. He picked out two prominent hills in the landscape, Jenkins Hill and a rise roughly a mile and a half to the northwest, and marked them as the two great poles of Republican government. On Jenkins Hill would stand the Congress House, what we now call the Capitol, while the northwestern elevation would host the President's House. These two structures, L'Enfant insisted, should command clear views of one another across a broad public mall, a visual line that would symbolize the connection between the legislative and executive branches. In L'Enfant's mind, the President's House was meant to be truly palatial. He envisioned a residence about 5 times larger than the structure that was ultimately built, a sprawling complex suited to state ceremonies, public receptions, and the everyday business of a growing nation. Set high on its hill, it would function as a Republican palace, visible from the Potomac River and from the avenues converging upon it. Broad prospects would stretch out in several directions, allowing the chief magistrate, at least symbolically, to survey the city and the country entrusted to his temporary care. But inside that grand vision were the seeds of L'Enfant's undoing. He refused to compromise on key elements of his plan, clashed constantly with the commissioners appointed to oversee the city's development, and insisted on tearing down any existing structures that interfered with his avenues. Those disputes escalated until he ordered the demolition of a manor house belonging to Daniel Carroll, a nephew of one of the most powerful commissioners, without proper authorization. That act pushed tensions past the breaking point. By February of 1792, less than a year after he had presented his design, L'Enfant was dismissed from the project. Even so, the heart of his vision survived. The commissioners kept the essential layout of diagonal avenues and the siting of the major federal buildings, while trimming back some of L'Enfant's more extravagant ideas. The President's House, especially, had to be reimagined as something more restrained. Impressive enough to project dignity, but not so lavish as to suggest a royal palace. That core tension between Republican simplicity and national grandeur would shape every major decision about the building's design. At that point, the commissioners made a choice that would have lasting consequences for the mansion's character. They decided to hold a public competition for the design of the President's House. In March of 1792, an advertisement ran in newspapers across the states. inviting architects and builders to submit plans for a residence that could house the president, his family, and a suitable number of servants. The prize was set at $500, or a medal of equal value, a significant reward for the time, even if it did not truly match the honor of designing the executive mansion of a new republic. The competition drew a curious mix of entries, from strictly practical schemes to almost fantastical visions, submitted by men whose names have mostly disappeared from the record, alongside one notable anonymous design later attributed to Thomas Jefferson himself. Out of that pile of drawings and dreams emerged a winning plan that would fix the architectural image of the American presidency for centuries, though not in a way any of the competitors, or even the commissioners, could fully imagine at the time. The designs that arrived through the spring and summer of 1792 revealed something fascinating about how Americans thought their president ought to live. Each plan was more than an architectural sketch. It was a political statement about the kind of executive power a young republic, fresh from a war against kings, was willing to accept. The commissioner's brief was deliberately vague, and almost certainly on purpose. The president's house should be commodious, large enough for official receptions and state business, but the exact size was left to each designer. It had to show dignity without drifting into showiness, grandeur without looking royal. That ambiguity opened the door to wildly different visions of what an executive mansion in a republic should be. Some entries leaned heavily on European palace traditions. They showed long facades, multiple wings, rich ornament, and ceremonial halls that would not have looked out of place in a royal residence. These schemes, unsurprisingly, found little favor with commissioners who were painfully aware of accusations that the new federal government already looked too much like a monarchy in disguise. Other submissions swung to the opposite extreme, offering buildings so modest and plain that they could just as easily have been the townhouse of a prosperous merchant. Practical, yes, but hardly the setting to receive foreign ambassadors or host state dinners. One particularly intriguing design came from an anonymous entrant who signed only with the initials AZ. The plan proposed a sprawling, villa-like structure, clearly inspired by Andrea Palladio's Italian Renaissance villas, with a central rotunda and symmetrical wings stretching out on either side. It was sophisticated, carefully proportioned, and obviously drawn by someone with real architectural training. Later research would show that this anonymous entry came from none other than Thomas Jefferson himself, who apparently could not resist submitting his own idea of what the president's house should be, despite serving as Secretary of State. Jefferson's design, however refined, had one fatal problem in the eyes of the commissioners. It felt too grand and too European, too close to the aristocratic houses he had admired in France. On top of that, they almost certainly guessed who had drawn it. Jefferson's love for Palladian forms was no secret. Accepting his design would look like favoring a powerful cabinet member. Rejecting it openly would create a political embarrassment. The simplest solution may have been the quiet one: set it aside and move on. Many of the other entries exposed the limits of architectural expertise in America at the time. The young republic had very few architects in the European sense of the word. Most builders had learned their trade by apprenticeship and hands-on work, not through formal study of classical rules and proportions. As a result, many submissions had a distinctly provincial character, structurally sound and practical, but missing the refinement and balance that might give the building real presence on the world stage. What the commissioners were really searching for, even if they struggled to say it clearly, was a design that could thread an almost impossibly narrow needle. The president's house had to be substantial enough to command respect from foreign powers used to dealing with kings and palaces, yet restrained enough to reassure American citizens that their president was still a fellow citizen, not a monarch in waiting. It needed to echo classical Republican models. Rome more than Versailles, while still working as a practical home for both official business and private family life. In short, the building had to embody the entire paradox of American executive power. Strong but limited, dignified yet democratic, permanent but never dynastic. As summer slid into autumn in 1792, the commissioners went through the submissions with growing frustration. None of the designs quite matched the vision in their heads. Some captured pieces of it, but failed in other key ways. The deadline passed, and still there was no obvious winner. It began to look as though the competition might end in disappointment, forcing the commissioners either to extend the call for entries or to quietly abandon the idea and hire someone directly. It was at exactly this point of uncertainty that a new design arrived, from an unexpected direction, not from a celebrated architect in Philadelphia or New York, but from an Irish immigrant builder living and working in Charleston, South Carolina. His name was James Hoban, and his calm, balanced proposal would go on to define what the home of the American president looks like for more than 2 centuries. The man whose design would eventually define the most famous address in America began life about as far from presidential grandeur as possible. James Hoban was born sometime around 1755 in County Kilkenny, Ireland, in the rural townland of Callan, a landscape of tenant farmers, small cottages, and narrow paths for a young man with talent, but no powerful family name to lean on. Ireland in the mid-18th century offered little real chance to rise, especially for Catholics living under the harsh penal laws that limited their right to own property, practice many professions, or take part fully in public life. Yet Hoban had both ambition and skill. As a teenager, he apprenticed to a builder, learning the hands-on work of masonry and carpentry, alongside the more refined craft of architectural drawing. His ability soon drew the attention of patrons who helped him enter the Dublin Society's drawing school, where promising students studied architectural drawing, perspective, and the classical orders that formed the backbone of Georgian design. During these formative years in Dublin, Hoban encountered a building that would leave a deep mark on his imagination. Leinster House, the grand townhouse of the Duke of Leinster, completed in 1748 to designs by Richard Cassels, Leinster House showed Georgian architecture at its most controlled and elegant. A solid stone structure with precise symmetry, calm proportions, and restrained classical detail. It projected aristocratic authority, but also a kind of cool Republican seriousness, avoiding the heavy decoration of Baroque palaces while still commanding attention. For Hoban, who was studying and likely working on buildings in this tradition, Leinster House seemed like a perfect model, architecture that spoke of permanence and dignity without tipping into royal display. After the American Revolution, a wave of emigrants left Ireland for the new United States, and skilled craftsmen found particular demand. Hoban crossed the Atlantic sometime in the mid-1780s. He settled first in Philadelphia and then moved south to Charleston, South Carolina, where a thriving port economy was driving a building boom and steady commissions. By 1792, Hoban had built a solid reputation in Charleston as both builder and architect, with several important projects to his name, including the state capitol building, a structure later destroyed by fire. When word of the competition for the president's house reached Charleston, Hoban recognized a chance that might never come again. He prepared his submission drawing heavily on his memories of Leinster House, reshaping its Georgian balance and classical restraint for an American Republican setting. His proposal called for a 3-story structure, counting the raised basement, constructed in stone, with a central entrance portico and evenly spaced rows of windows across the front. The plan was essentially a refined rectangle, large state rooms on the principal floor, family quarters above, service spaces below, practical, dignified, and clearly rooted in the Irish-Georgian tradition he had absorbed in Dublin. Crucially, Hoban understood something many competitors misjudged: scale. His building was large but not overwhelming, Stately enough for receptions and diplomatic events, yet compact enough to function as a real home, where L'Enfant had imagined a residence roughly 5 times larger, and Jefferson had envisioned an elaborate villa. Hoban offered a structure that could plausibly be built within a realistic budget and timeline, while still giving the office of the president visible weight. Hoban's design also carried a subtle advantage that might be called studied neutrality. It avoided dramatic stylistic gestures that could be read as political statements. The Georgian language, already familiar in America from colonial public buildings and houses, felt established rather than experimental, classical rather than fashionable, stable rather than showy. In a moment of sharp political division, that kind of architectural diplomacy may have been exactly what the commissioners wanted, even if they never put it into words. When the commissioners met in July of 1792 to evaluate the final entries, Hoban's plan stood out not because it broke new ground, but because it combined competence, clarity, and the right level of ambition. President Washington, who took part in the final choice, reportedly appreciated both the practicality and the dignity of the design. On July 16, 1792, exactly 2 years after the Residence Act was signed, James Hoban was declared the winner of the competition. He received the promised prize of $500, and far more importantly, the commission to oversee the construction of the President's House. The little-known Irish immigrant had secured the chance to shape America's most symbolic residence. The harder part still lay ahead, turning paper drawings into stone walls rising from a muddy hillside on the banks of the Potomac. The distance between a beautiful architectural drawing and a real building rising out of swampy ground is not measured in inches. It is measured in thousands of hours of back-breaking work, endless supply problems, and the kind of stubborn persistence that rarely makes it into history books. After winning the commission, James Hoban now had to turn his calm, neat plans into stone and mortar on a site that looked as if nature had designed it to fight him at every step. The ceremonial laying of the cornerstone took place on October 13, 1792, in a Masonic ritual led by the Lodge of Georgetown. The formal speeches, measured steps, and symbolic tools gave the moment an air of harmony and control. In reality, they were blessing the start of an extraordinarily difficult project in a location that was barely ready to hold a barn, let alone a presidential mansion. The chosen site for the president's house sat on a modest rise, not the dramatic hilltop L'Enfant had once imagined, but high enough to offer some drainage and a clear view. That slight elevation would prove crucial because the surrounding ground stayed stubbornly wet and unstable. Before a single foundation stone could be laid, the land had to be tamed. The area was thickly wooded, and crews spent weeks cutting down trees, pulling stumps, and hacking away undergrowth. Then came grading and leveling the ground, an exhausting process made worse by clay-heavy soil that turned into sticky mud whenever it rained. Workers dug drainage ditches to pull water away from the future basement. But these channels constantly needed clearing and repair, as the Potomac's seasonal floods tested every makeshift solution. For much of that first year, more shovels than chisels were at work. The site had to be bullied into becoming something that looked even roughly like a place where a foundation could safely sit. The workforce that gathered on this muddy rise reflected the mixed, unequal world of early American labor. Hoban brought several skilled craftsmen from Charleston, many of them Irish and Scottish stonemasons, who knew how to handle the local Aquia Creek sandstone chosen for the exterior. Their expertise earned relatively high wages for the time, often $1 or more a day, a respectable rate in the 1790s. Working alongside them were local laborers, men drawn by the promise of steady pay and the rare chance to say they were helping build something the entire country was watching. From the very beginning, however, the project also leaned heavily on enslaved labor, commissioners, always short of money and struggling to attract enough workers to this remote, unhealthy site, turned to the solution that Virginia and Maryland elites used whenever they needed many hands. They hired enslaved men from nearby plantations. These workers were rented out by the year or the season. The payments went not to the men doing the digging and lifting, but to the people who claimed to own them. Almost all of this heavy work fell on the shoulders of enslaved black men. This system kept costs down and work moving, but it also stamped a brutal truth into the very foundations of the president's house. Men who would never be allowed to vote, never count this margarity electoways, never legally own land, and never enjoy the rights the new republic claimed to cherish, were building the home from which laws and policies about their bondage would be signed. The commissioners' account books carefully recorded money paid to slaveholders, but often reduced the actual workers to a cold, repeated phrase, Negro hire. Even on paper, the people whose bodies made the house possible were rendered faceless. As late 1792 slid into winter, foundation work continued. Crews excavated the basement level that would one day hold kitchens, storage rooms, and service corridors. The foundation walls were laid in local stone, set in lime mortar, and built course by course. Progress was slow by necessity. Each section had to sit and harden before more weight could safely rest on top of it. Winter brought its own set of problems, freezing temperatures that could crack fresh mortar, short daylight hours, and the simple difficulty of keeping men working outside when cold, wind, and mud turned every day into a test of endurance. By the spring of 1793, after more than 6 months of clearing, digging, draining, and laying hidden stone, the site finally reached a crucial turning point. The outline of the basement was in place, the foundations were secure, and the hill above the Potomac was ready for something the eye could at last see. The stage was set for the most demanding and visible phase of the project, raising the heavy stone walls that would give the president's house its shape and its silhouette on the American horizon for centuries to come. With the foundations finally secure and the spring of 1793 bringing warmer weather, attention shifted to the hard part everyone would actually see, lifting the president's house above ground. This was the moment when Hoban's careful lines on paper had to turn into solid walls, and it demanded a mix of precise craftsmanship and raw physical effort that pushed every worker on the site. The main building material, Aquia Creek sandstone, came from quarries in Stafford County, Virginia, roughly 40 miles south of the future capital. The choice was practical. The stone was relatively soft, so masons could cut and shape it more easily than harder granites. It existed in large enough quantities for a project of this size. Most importantly, it could travel by water. The quarries lay close to navigable inlets, so massive blocks could be loaded onto barges and floated up the Potomac toward the construction site. Without this river route, without the canal de Trace, and without the swivert, the rough dirt roads of the era would never have survived the weight and volume of stone needed for a building of such ambition. Each block's journey from raw rock face to finished wall passed through many hands and several dangerous stages. At the quarries, workers, again a mix of free laborers and enslaved men hired from nearby plantations, used hammers, wedges, and iron bars to split the stone along its natural grain, breaking loose rough blocks that could weigh several hundred pounds or more. These pieces were then maneuvered onto barges using wooden cranes, levers, and a lot of shouting, with every lift carrying the risk of a rope snapping or a block shifting and crushing whoever stood too close. The barge trip upriver could take several days, depending on wind, current, and tide. By the time the blocks reached the wharves at Georgetown, many had chipped edges or hairline cracks. Before the stone could become part of a presidential wall, it needed more work, trimming, squaring, and sometimes cutting away damaged sections altogether. All of that meant more labor, more time, and more risk of waste if a weakened block finally failed on the scaffolding. Once a block arrived at the building site, its real transformation began. Skilled stonemasons, many of them Irish and Scottish craftsmen trained in Georgian traditions, took over. With hammers, chisels, and years of experience behind each swing, they turned those rough pieces into ashlar, the clean, rectangular stones that give the president's house its calm, ordered look. A single block might take hours of steady work, knocking off excess, sharpening corners, checking with the straightage, and refining the visible face until it matched the measured lines in Hoban's drawings. There was little room for error. A stone cut too short or too thin could not be patched. It had to be discarded, taking with it all the work already invested. At the same time, other crews handled the invisible ingredient that would bind the whole structure together: lime mortar. Producing it was a demanding process of its own. Workers burned limestone in kilns at intense heat for days, then carefully slaked the quicklime with water, turning it into a usable paste. The mix had to be right. Too much lime and the mortar would shrink and crack as it dried. Too little and it would never gain the strength needed to hold up heavy stone walls. Skilled masons blended the slaked lime with sand and water just before use, knowing the mixture would start to set within hours and could not be stored for another day. Building the walls was slow, deliberate work. Rows of finished ashlar were laid course by course, each horizontal layer needing to sit perfectly level before another could be added on top. Masons relied on plumb lines and spirit levels to keep both vertical and horizontal lines true, fully aware that even small errors at the lower levels would multiply as the structure rose, threatening the building's stability. Around them, wooden scaffolding crept upward with the walls. Tied together with rope and constantly adjusted, workers pulled stones up ramps or lifted them using block and tackle, guiding each piece into position with shouted instructions and calloused hands. The work did not stop for weather, so much as bend under it. Summers on the Potomac brought thick heat, insects, and glare bouncing off pale stone. Winters brought freezing winds that stung fingers numb and threatened to damage fresh mortar if temperatures dropped too quickly. Progress depended on more than weather, though. Funding delays slowed the purchase of materials. Shortages of skilled labor forced constant reshuffling of tasks. By modern standards, the pace was painfully slow. Weeks of effort might raise the wall only a few feet. Yet step by step, the structure emerged. Gradually, the building's Georgian proportions began to appear against the sky. The south facade, the south took shape first, with regular openings left for windows and a central section reserved for the future portico. What had been a rough rise above a boggy riverbank now held visible proof that the grand promises made on parchment in Philadelphia were being translated into stone. Every inch of that progress, every block set and joint filled, depended entirely on the people doing the lifting, cutting, and mixing. To understand what the president's house really cost, beyond money, beyond political bargaining, we have to look closely at those hands and at the very different lives of the men whose labor made these walls rise. The workforce that raised the president's house out of the Potomac mud embodied, in one crowded construction site, all the contradictions of the early American Republic. On any given day in the 1790s, you would see a clear hierarchy of labor: highly paid master craftsmen, journeymen trying to climb the ladder, and enslaved men whose wages went straight into someone else's pocket. All working together to build a house meant to stand for democratic government. At the top stood the European-trained master craftsmen, especially the stonemasons and carpenters whose knowledge simply could not be replaced. Many had come from Ireland, Scotland, and England, drawn by the promise of higher pay and more opportunity than they could hope for at home. James Hoban kept close ties to the Irish building community and recruited heavily from Charleston and other port cities where Irish workers had settled. These masters earned substantial wages, often between $1 and $2 a day plus room and board, and their names appear again and again in the commissioner's account books. Colin Williamson, the Scottish stonemason who oversaw much of the exterior, Philip Hart and John Sheehan, Irish carpenters responsible for shaping the building's interior woodwork. Below them worked journeymen and apprentices, men still learning the trade or not yet established enough to demand the highest rates. They might earn 50 to 75 cents a day. Still a decent income that could support a family and, in time, fund their own rise to master status. The commissioners tried hard to attract these workers, placing newspaper advertisements across the mid-Atlantic and promising steady employment on a project of national importance. Even so, keeping the site fully staffed was a constant struggle. The capital's remoteness, the suffocating climate, and the availability of other work in older, more comfortable cities meant the president's house was always competing for hands. That persistent shortage pushed the commissioners toward a solution that Virginia and Maryland planters already knew well: enslaved labor. Increasingly, they turned to hiring out enslaved men from nearby plantations. Enslavers signed contracts lending their workers to the project for a month, a season, or an entire year. The commissioners paid the owners. The men doing the work received nothing beyond basic food and shelter. The records show this system in cold, precise language. Payments to Charles Diggers for 5 Negro men for 1 year, money to Notley Young for hire of slaves, and similar entries listing plantation owners while the workers themselves remained unnamed. These enslaved men carried much of the heaviest, dirtiest, and most dangerous burden on the site. They quarried and hauled stone, mixed mortar, dragged materials up scaffolding, dug drainage ditches, and cleared trees and stumps. Some brought real skill. Documents mention enslaved carpenters, bricklayers, and even stonemasons. Yet even when their expertise matched that of free workers, they were typically rated at lower pay, with every cent still going to their enslavers. A man hauling stone blocks in the Washington summer, wearing thin clothing and poor shoes, living on rations calculated for low cost rather than health, faced conditions that would test even modern construction crews with better tools and safety gear. Working side by side did not erase the social line between free and enslaved workers. It made that line sharper. Some free laborers resented the presence of enslaved men on the site, arguing that slave competition drove down their own wages and made it harder to negotiate better terms. Enslavers, meanwhile, treated their workers as property, even in this public setting, complaining loudly when men were injured or sick and demanding compensation for damaged labor. The commissioners had to juggle all of this, mediating disputes, responding to owners' complaints, and trying to keep enough workers on the job as people fell ill, ran away, or simply refused to continue under such harsh conditions. Despite the government's reputation for detailed paperwork, enslaved workers were often all but erased in the official records. Free workers appeared by full name and trade, paid to John Davis for mason work. Enslaved men appeared as categories: Negro hire, slave labor, or at best a single first name attached to an enslaver's account. Years of back-breaking work on the president's house might be summed up in a single bland line item. Their bodies helped turn Hoban's drawings into stone walls, yet the bureaucracy reduced them to anonymous units of cost. It would take many generations before historians began the slow, careful work of pulling these figures out of the shadows, tracking down scattered references, cross-checking ledgers and letters, and recovering at least some of the names and stories of the men who built America's most famous house, while being denied the basic freedoms that house was supposed to represent. By the autumn of 1800, The president's house was still frustratingly unfinished, yet events left no choice. It had to take in its first residents. The 10-year deal that allowed Philadelphia to serve as the temporary capital had expired, and the federal government was obligated to move to the new city on the Potomac, ready or not. President John Adams, nearing the end of his bitterly contested single term, found himself in the strange position of moving into a residence that was, in many ways, still a construction site. The house that awaited the Adams family only partly matched Hoban's vision. The exterior walls were up, the Aquia Creek sandstone giving the building a commanding presence on its low hill. The roof was in place, finally keeping out the rain. Inside, though, things were rough. Only 6 rooms had been plastered and made even marginally livable. Staircases stood unfinished. The planned grand entrance on the north front had no portico, so visitors climbed temporary wooden steps instead. Outside, the grounds were a mess of timber stacks, clay heaps, broken stone, and workers' shacks, more a workyard than a setting for presidential receptions. Even so, Adams left Philadelphia in early November, bumping along the rough road south while wagons carried his furniture and official papers. He arrived at the president's house on November 1st, 1800, becoming the first chief executive to sleep under its new roof. His wife Abigail stayed behind for several weeks to manage family affairs in Massachusetts. On his first night in the building, Adams wrote to her with a mix of hope and unease, adding the line that would later be carved into myth: "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." When Abigail Adams finally arrived in mid-November, her reaction was far less romantic than her husband's blessing. In letters to friends and relatives, she described a daily grind of discomfort and improvisation. The house was constantly cold. Only a handful of fireplaces were finished and drawing properly. Firewood in the new capital was scarce and expensive, so keeping the rooms even tolerably warm required constant planning and worry. Outside the mansion, there was almost nothing. Washington City was little more than scattered buildings in muddy clearings. With the Capitol as unfinished as the president's house, and few real shops or services within reach, Abigail's most memorable adjustment involved the East Room, the largest space in the house, designed for grand receptions and state events. In reality, with bare walls and rough flooring, it was useless for anything formal, so she turned it into a giant laundry. The room's size and ventilation made it perfect for hanging clothes, and soon the space meant to host dignitaries was filled with damp linens and shirts strung on makeshift lines. The image is hard to forget. The first family's undergarments and bed sheets swaying in the draught, where the young republic had imagined elegant assemblies and glittering ceremonies. Inside this half-finished shell, the Adams household staff struggled to keep even basic routines going. Servants hauled water by hand from nearby springs because the house had no plumbing of any kind. Cooking happened in the basement kitchen over open fires, with hot dishes then carried up narrow stairways to the family's rooms. With so few finished spaces, official entertaining took place in cramped, awkward settings that fell far short of what a head of state needed to receive foreign diplomats or host congressional leaders. In many respects, the Adams administration in the new capital played out inside a kind of polite chaos, the machinery of government squeezed into the realities of a building site. Fortunately for the family, this uncomfortable chapter did not last long. Adams lost the fiercely fought election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, his former ally turned sharp political enemy. The defeat meant he would live in the unfinished president's house for only about 4 months, from November of 1800 to March of 1801. Wounded by the loss, Adams reportedly left Washington before dawn on Inauguration Day, heading back to Massachusetts and pointedly avoiding Jefferson's swearing in. The job of turning the president's house from a barely habitable shell into something closer to its intended dignity would fall not to Adams, but to the man who had once slipped an anonymous design into the original competition, Thomas Jefferson. His refined architectural taste and his deep personal contradictions would leave a lasting mark on the building itself and on the moral compromises woven into its completion. Thomas Jefferson took office in March of 1801 with strong views about architecture, Republican symbolism, and how a president ought to live. Where John Adams had simply put up with an unfinished house, Jefferson saw a chance to reshape it, to bend the building toward his own ideas. But his years in the president's house would also expose, more clearly than almost any other presidency, how far American ideals stood from American realities. Jefferson had opinions about the president's house long before he carried its keys. In the design competition years earlier, he had quietly submitted his own anonymous proposal, a modest villa in the Palladian style he loved. Now, as president, he found himself living not in that villa, but in James Hoban's solid Georgian mansion, which he privately considered a little dull. Still, Jefferson was nothing if not practical. Instead of tearing down what existed, he focused on strategic changes, places where he could leave a clear mark without ripping the building apart. His most important structural additions were the east and west terraces, low colonnaded wings stretching from either side of the main block. On paper, they were simple. In practice, they solved several problems at once. The terraces hid stables, storage rooms, and work areas behind elegant rows of columns. They gave the house the classical touches Jefferson thought a Republican building needed, and they linked the main residence to its service buildings without scattering separate outbuildings across the grounds. In Jefferson's mind, these wings were proof that beauty and practicality did not need to fight each other. Inside, Jefferson turned his attention to rooms that, under Adams, had been barely usable. He oversaw the purchase and placement of furnishings, often choosing pieces in the French style he had admired as minister to France. The East Room, the giant space Abigail Adams had used for laundry, stayed unfinished through his entire presidency. Jefferson had little interest in huge ceremonial gatherings. He preferred smaller, more controlled settings. Instead of rushing to complete a grand ballroom, he invested in the spaces where he actually lived and worked, a well-stocked library, writing rooms for letters and scientific instruments, and dining rooms suited to the intimate dinners that became his favorite way to conduct politics. Jefferson treated the land around the house with the same care. A passionate gardener and farmer, he oversaw the planting of trees and the layout of gardens. He imagined the president's house grounds as something between a working farm and a gentleman's estate, not a showpiece of pure ornament, but a place where productivity itself would signal Republican virtue. Vegetable plots appeared. Experimental crops took root. Slowly, the muddy construction site began to look more like a managed landscape. Beneath this cultivated surface, however, lay a reality Jefferson could never fully explain away. The work of finishing and refining the president's house still rested heavily on enslaved labor. Jefferson brought enslaved people from Monticello to serve in the mansion as cooks, servants, and laborers. They maintained his household in Washington while the law still counted them as his property. The contradiction was staggering. The author of All Men Are Created Equal, running a presidential home staffed in part by men and women who could be bought and sold. The building work during Jefferson's 2 terms followed the same pattern that had been set from the beginning. The terraces he added, the landscape he ordered, the interior finishing he supervised, all relied on a mixed workforce. Free craftsmen earned wages, and in theory, could walk away. Enslaved workers could not. Some of those enslaved men were highly skilled, yet the pay for their work went to their owners. Their labor made Jefferson's improvements possible, even as the system they were trapped in mocked the very ideas the building was supposed to represent. Jefferson was not blind to this. In his letters, he could condemn slavery as a moral wrong and a threat to the Republic. In his daily life, he continued to depend on it, expanding his own holdings, even as he wrote of its dangers. That tension, clear in his words, harsher in his actions, took physical form in the president's house. Here was a structure meant to embody equality before the law, maintained by a hierarchy so unequal that some of the people who worked there did not legally own their own bodies. The terraces, gardens, and carefully arranged interiors Jefferson added would outlast his time in office, shaping how later presidents experienced the building. But the moral compromises woven into the house during his tenure would also endure. They sat quietly in the stone, in the service corridors, in the memories of those who labored there without choice, waiting for future generations to acknowledge them openly, even when that honesty threatened the comforting myths of the founding era. And all of this refinement, all of Jefferson's careful shaping of the president's house, was about to be tested in the harshest possible way. Not by a political rival or a tight budget, but by invading troops and open flame. The War of 1812, that often overlooked clash between the United States and Britain, had dragged on for more than 2 years with no clear winner, when in the summer of 1814, British strategy suddenly shifted. With Napoleon defeated in Europe and veteran troops now available, Britain decided to strike directly at the American capital. A calculated blow meant to humiliate the young republic and force better peace terms. The president's house, symbol of American executive power, was about to become a very visible casualty of imperial payback. By August of 1814, British forces under Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn had landed in Maryland and begun their march toward Washington. The American defense, thrown together in haste and poorly coordinated, collapsed at the Battle of Bladensburg on August 24th. President James Madison, who had actually ridden out to watch the fighting, making him the only sitting president to personally witness combat while in office, saw American militia units break and run before disciplined British regulars. With the defenders scattered, the road to Washington lay wide open. Madison hurried back to the president's house and found a Capitol in full retreat. Officials fled with trunks of papers, citizens scrambled to evacuate, and inside the mansion, his wife Dolly was directing one of the most famous rescue efforts in presidential history. Calm under pressure as British troops closed in, Dolly Madison oversaw the packing of key state documents and, more famously, insisted on saving Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington. The canvas was screwed firmly to the wall in the state dining room. Rather than waste time with careful unscrewing, her servants smashed the frame and cut the painting free. That single act of cultural triage, carried out as an invading army approached, fixed Dolly Madison's place in American memory. Even though it was only one moment in a day full of disasters. As the Madisons crossed the Potomac and headed west, British troops marched almost unopposed into Washington on the evening of August 24th. What followed at the president's house has taken on a legendary glow, but the core details are well documented. British officers, led by Admiral Cockburn, entered the mansion and found it empty, but with the dinner still laid out in the state dining room. Whether the meal had been prepared for the Madisons' possible return or simply left during the rush to evacuate remains uncertain. The officers did what hungry soldiers do. They sat down and ate it. Seated at the American president's own table, they reportedly toasted the success of British arms while finishing his abandoned dinner. It was part practicality, part theater. A small, sharp gesture that mocked the idea of American sovereignty even before the flames were lit. Then, they set about destroying the building. The goal was not random looting, but the deliberate crippling of government infrastructure. British soldiers dragged furniture into piles, added books, papers, curtains, and anything else that would burn, and set fires throughout the mansion. For 14 years, the house had been filling with wooden furniture, wall paneling, doors, and carpets, perfect fuel. The Aquia Creek sandstone walls, which had taken so long to raise, could withstand fire, but nearly everything inside them was wood: floors, staircases, roof timbers, window frames. Once the flames caught, the interior burned fiercely. Heat built until glass shattered, beams snapped, and whole sections of flooring crashed down into the basement. That night, a violent summer thunderstorm rolled over the city, the kind of brutal storm common along the Potomac. Sheets of rain poured through the burning roof. Some accounts suggest that this downpour may have kept the mansion from being completely destroyed, dousing fires before they could reduce the entire structure to rubble. Even so, by dawn on August 25th, the president's house was a ruin. From the outside, the building still stood, its stone walls blackened and cracked from the heat. Inside, it was a shell. Staircases had collapsed. Floors had fallen through. The roof was mostly gone. Jefferson's terraces were damaged. The contents of the house were either looted, shattered, or burned. The gardens, which Jefferson had tried to shape into a Republican estate, had been trampled into mud. The British stayed in Washington for roughly 24 hours. In that short time, they also burned the Capitol, the Treasury, and several other government buildings, then withdrew. They left behind a capital city physically wrecked and a young nation deeply shaken. The United States had gone to war to defend its independence and now had to face the fact that its own capital had been occupied, and its most symbolic buildings reduced to smoldering shells. Yet even in the ashes, the story did not end. No serious voice argued that the president's house should be abandoned. The real question was different. If the nation rebuilt, would it simply put the old mansion back together, or use the destruction as a chance to reshape it? And with it, the image of the American presidency itself? In the days after the British attack, with smoke still drifting from the president's house and the Capitol standing in similar ruin, a hard question landed in Congress. Should Washington even survive as the capital? Some representatives argued that the fire had exposed the original mistake, placing the nation's seat of government in a remote, poorly defended swamp. They pushed to move the capital back to an established city like Philadelphia or New York, or perhaps farther west to follow the expanding frontier. Others warned that abandoning Washington now would hand Britain a victory far greater than anything it had won on the battlefield. If the United States walked away from its burned capital, they argued, it would look like the young republic had lost its nerve. That argument carried the day. The decision was made to stay and to rebuild. Once that was settled, another question followed almost automatically. Who should lead the restoration of the president's house? The answer was both practical and symbolic. James Hoban, the original architect, would be called back to bring his creation back from the brink. By this point, Hoban was in his late 50s, established in Washington, with a web of architectural and building interests. Seeing his greatest work reduced to a gutted shell must have been painful, but he accepted the commission with a mix of professional pride and personal determination. He would not just repair the house. He would prove that the building and the nation could come back from disaster. The first task was to understand exactly what remained. During the winter from 1814 into 1815, Hoban and his team surveyed the ruins in careful detail. The exterior sandstone walls, though smoke-stained and weakened in spots, were still sound, proof that the original masonry had been done well. The east and west terraces, added under Jefferson, had survived with damage that could be fixed. Inside, however, almost everything was gone. The floors, staircases, roof timbers, interior partitions, window frames, doors. All the wood that made the stone shell into a home had burned. What lay ahead was not simple repair work. It was full interior reconstruction, almost as demanding as building the place from scratch. Congress appropriated funds for the job. At first not enough, then supplemented as costs became clearer. And construction began in earnest in the spring of 1815. The workforce looked very familiar. Irish and Scottish stonemasons returned to handle the masonry. American carpenters took on the new framing and finish work. Enslaved laborers, once again hired from nearby Maryland and Virginia plantations, provided much of the heavy lifting and rough work. Some of the craftsmen who had worked on the original building came back, now 20 years older, but carrying invaluable memory of how the house had first been put together. In an era before copies of blueprints were easily made and stored, that lived knowledge often filled in the gaps where drawings and specifications had been lost or damaged. One of the most important choices of the reconstruction concerned the exterior stone. The fire had left the Aquia Creek sandstone discolored and more porous. Smoke stains marked the walls. The intense heat had pitted and roughened the surface. Some stones had cracked and had to be replaced, but tearing down and rebuilding the entire exterior was neither necessary nor affordable. Hoban proposed a different solution: coat the whole exterior in white paint. This was not just cosmetic. A thick layer of lead-based white paint would seal the stone, slow weathering, and give the walls a consistent, clean surface that hid the worst fire scars. At the same time, it changed how the house looked from a distance. Instead of pale, mottled sandstone, the building now appeared as a bright, uniform block of white. That decision quietly locked in the mansion's future identity. Even before the burning, some people had occasionally referred to the building as the White House, likely because of the naturally light color of the stone. But after Hoban's reconstruction, with the exterior deliberately painted, the nickname became unavoidable. The bright white facade stood out starkly against the still, thin cityscape of Washington, and could be seen from far across the open fields. The title White House would not become the official name until President Theodore Roosevelt made it formal in 1901. But from 1817 onward, the visual cue was impossible to miss. Rebuilding the inside gave Hoban a rare second chance. 2 decades of actual use had revealed what worked well and what did not. He took the opportunity to adjust staircases for better traffic flow, tweak room proportions, and fold in newer conveniences available by 1815. More efficient heating systems, improved window designs, and better interior finishes. Yet he did not turn the house into a different building. The proportions, the basic layout, and the overall Georgian character stayed faithful to his original vision. Anyone who had seen the mansion before the fire would still recognize it after the work was done. Driven by wounded national pride and a desire to show resilience to the world, the reconstruction moved at a pace that would have surprised those who remembered the slow rise of the original walls. By the autumn of 1817, the president's house was ready once again to be lived in. President James Monroe and his family moved in that November, almost exactly 17 years after John Adams had first taken up residence. Monroe walked into a house that, in many ways, was better than the one Adams had found. The interiors were more refined, the circulation made more sense, and the white exterior pulled the composition together with a clarity it had never quite had before. The building now told a very particular story. The Republic might be attacked, even burned, but it would not vanish. It would rebuild, and it would do so in a way the whole world could see. The president's house had survived its trial by fire, but as the 19th century unfolded, new pressures, technological change, expanding government, shifting social expectations, and the simple wear of time would test the building again and again, turning a once new mansion into an aging national symbol in constant need of care. In the decades after Hoban's reconstruction, the president's house slowly shifted from a relatively plain executive mansion into something much closer to the building we recognize today. The changes were not just about style. They reflected a growing nation, an expanding presidency, and the arrival of new technologies that quietly rewired how the house actually worked, even as its white classical shell continued to suggest timeless stability. The most important architectural additions came in the early 19th century, during the 1820s and early 1830s, when Hoban, still acting as the building's architect and caretaker, finally realized parts of his original 1792 scheme. Chief among them were the north and south porticos. The south portico came first, completed in 1824. It created the now iconic coved colonnade on the garden side, an elegant semicircle supported by tall Ionic columns. The structure offered practical shelter for the ceremonial entrance and, just as importantly, gave the mansion a powerful, stage-like facade looking out over the grounds. That graceful curve, which would one day anchor countless photographs and newsreels, was originally just Hoban's deferred idea finally brought to life. The north portico followed in 1829, though with a different character. Instead of a sweeping curve, it took the form of a rectangular porte cochere, more straightforward and utilitarian. This made sense. The north side faced the city and served as the main arrival point for most visitors, so the emphasis there was on function as much as appearance. Together, the two porticos completed the composition Hoban had sketched nearly 30 years earlier, giving the house the balanced, formal profile that would define its silhouette for generations. Not everyone cheered these changes. Critics complained that the porticos made the president's house look too European, too close to a small palace for a country that prided itself on rejecting monarchy. But by the 1820s, the nation's confidence had grown. Fears that a few more columns would turn the president into a king no longer carried the same weight they had in the fragile first years of the Republic. Inside, the building never stopped changing. Every administration left its fingerprints on the rooms: new furniture, updated fabrics, different colors on the walls, new paintings filling empty space. Practical needs shifted as well. The East Room, which had remained unfinished or only half-finished through multiple presidencies, and had once doubled as Abigail Adams' laundry room, was finally developed into a true state reception room during Andrew Jackson's administration in the 1830s. From then on, it served more closely to its original intended role as the setting for large public events. Technological change arrived more quietly, but altered daily life far more than a new wallpaper pattern ever could. The first big leap came with the arrival of running water in the 1830s. Pipes brought water into the house, ending the constant hauling of heavy buckets up and down stairs from outdoor pumps and wells. By later standards, this system was basic, but for the people living and working inside the mansion, it was a revolution. Bathing became less of a logistical ordeal. The kitchens worked more efficiently, and overall hygiene noticeably improved. In the 1840s, under President James K. Polk, gas lighting began to replace the flicker of candles and oil lamps. Gas lines were threaded through the house, and new fixtures appeared in major rooms, their glass shades and warm glow transforming evening life inside the mansion. For years, though, gas and older lighting methods coexisted. Gas was expensive, and not every space justified the cost, so many rooms still relied on traditional lamps. For nearly 4 decades, the soft hiss and golden light of gas defined the atmosphere of White House nights. The next leap came at the end of the century. In 1891, during Benjamin Harrison's administration, electric lighting was installed throughout the building. The White House was not an early adopter by national standards, Parts of Washington had enjoyed electric light for roughly a decade, but wiring a house that had never been designed for cables and switches was a major project. Electric lines had to be run through thick masonry and old framing, fixtures chosen and installed, and the new system made to function alongside the existing gas network because no one fully trusted electricity yet. The Harrison family themselves reportedly viewed the technology with real suspicion. Stories from the time described them avoiding the switches, worried about shocks from the unfamiliar system. On some nights, lights were left burning simply because no one wanted to risk turning them off. The house had entered the electric age, but its human occupants needed time to catch up. Heating followed a similar path of gradual modernization. The original fireplaces, romantic in paintings, were miserable in practice. Wildly inefficient and unable to keep the drafty rooms comfortable during Washington's damp, chilling winters. Beginning in the 1850s and continuing in stages afterward, steam heating systems with radiators were added. Boilers in the basement fed hot water and steam into a web of pipes, ending in radiators tucked along walls and under windows. This change, largely invisible to visitors, made the house far more livable as a year-round residence. Yet all of these upgrades, porticos, running water, gas lines, electrical wiring, heating pipes, were layered onto a structure that was slowly getting old. The president's house was no longer a fresh symbol rising from the mud. It was becoming an aging building with growing pains, asked to support more people, more technology, and more expectations than its original designers could ever have imagined. By the early decades of the 20th century, the president's house had been in constant use for more than 100 years. It had sheltered generations of first families, hosted state dinners and official receptions, and carried the daily weight of executive business. All that use, layered over early 19th century engineering, pushed the structure far beyond what its builders had imagined. From the outside, the white facade still looked calm and solid. Behind it, the building had begun to show alarming signs that it was literally coming apart. The problem was, at its core, an engineering one. Hoban's original design, though sound for its time, had never been meant to handle the loads and vibrations that came with a century of additions and constant use. Successive presidents had carved new staircases into old walls, added rooms, installed elevators, and loaded the building with heavy modern equipment. Each alteration made life easier upstairs, while quietly weakening the skeleton underneath. By the 20th century, many of the wooden floor joists and beams, some dating back to the 18-teens reconstruction, were in serious trouble. Plaster ceilings sagged in unsettling curves, floors flexed and bounced underfoot. During concerts in the East Room, guests could feel the floor tremble, and chandeliers visibly swayed with the music. The house still hosted glamorous events, but structurally it was more tired boarding house than indestructible monument. Theodore Roosevelt, during his presidency from 1901 to 1909, launched the first major 20th century overhaul. His focus, though, was on function and layout rather than deep structural repair. He created the West Wing to pull official offices away from the family's living quarters, reorganizing how the building was used. That move relieved some day-to-day pressure on the main house, but it did not fix the underlying weakness in the old beams and joists. Later presidents grumbled about the condition of the building, but a true gut renovation seemed impossible. Where would a sitting president live? How could the government run if the executive mansion was stripped down to bare walls? The White House had become too central to the ritual of American politics to shut it down easily. So problems were acknowledged, reports were filed, and then set aside as the building quietly grew weaker. The breaking point came under Harry Truman. In 1948, engineers doing what was supposed to be a routine inspection made a frightening discovery. The interior was dangerously close to collapse. The warning sign was almost darkly comic. The leg of Margaret Truman's piano punched straight through the floor of her sitting room, When structural experts took a closer look, they found that many beams were no longer truly holding up the floors. In some places, plaster, paint, and habit were doing more to keep things in place than actual structural wood. It became clear that the White House had been flirting with disaster for years. Truman responded in his usual direct style. He approved a complete gutting and reconstruction of the interior. This was not a simple remodel. It was near total rebuilding. In 1949, the Truman family moved across Pennsylvania Avenue to Blair House, and crews began one of the most ambitious preservation projects in American history. Inside the stone shell, everything came out. Workers dismantled rooms piece by piece, carefully labeling and storing doors, mantels, paneling, and decorative plaster so they could later be returned to their proper places. Beneath the building, crews dug out new basement levels to make space for modern mechanical systems. Within the original exterior walls, engineers erected a full steel frame, effectively constructing a new, modern building inside a historic stone box. As walls were opened and floors removed, the house began to give up its secrets. Hidden on old beams were carvings and signatures left by the craftsmen who had worked on the original construction and on Hoban's post-fire rebuild. Names, dates, brief scratched messages. Many of these men had vanished from the written record. Their marks in the wood were the only proof that they had ever set foot on the site. Archaeologists and workers in the sub-basement areas uncovered artifacts from the mansion's earlier life, fragments of broken pottery, discarded tools, scraps of the original building materials. Each find added another tiny piece to the puzzle of how the president's house had actually been built and lived in across more than a century. The renovation was not just saving a structure, it was exposing the layers of history embedded in it. The reconstruction took nearly 4 years and cost more than $5 million, a staggering sum for the time. When the Truman family returned in 1952, they were walking into what was, in practical terms, a brand new house, wearing an old stone face. The rooms had been rebuilt with great care to match their historical appearance, but behind the period paneling and ornate plasterwork stood 20th century steel, concrete, and updated systems. Now the building could safely hold large crowds, support modern communications equipment, and offer the heating, plumbing, and electrical capacity that mid-century life demanded. The White House looked to most visitors very much as it had before, but under the familiar surfaces, it had been transformed. Even as crews restored staterooms and presidential living spaces, however, a deeper question began to surface. Whose stories were being preserved in this careful reconstruction, and whose labor and lives had been quietly edited out of the official history of America's most famous house? For nearly 2 centuries after its construction, the official story of the White House focused almost entirely on presidents, architects, and a handful of prominent free craftsmen. The enslaved men who helped build and run the house were, at best, background figures, and at worst, erased completely. That silence was not an accident. It reflected a deliberate way of remembering American history that looked away from the most uncomfortable truths hiding inside its proudest symbols. Recovering the names and stories of those enslaved workers has become one of the most important shifts in how the building's past is now told. Serious efforts to document their contributions began only in the 1970s and 1980s, when historians shaped by the new social history started reading the old records with fresh questions. The commissioner's account books from the 1790s and early 1800s, preserved in the National Archives, turned out to be crucial. Page after page listed payments to slaveholders for Negro hire. These ledgers treated enslaved workers as rented property, not as people, but they still proved something vital. Enslaved labor was not a side note. It was central to the construction of the president's house from the very beginning. The next step was harder, moving beyond these cold line items to find real names and lives. That work turned into a kind of historical detective story. Researchers cross-checked plantation ledgers, private letters, newspaper ads, census records, any scrap of paper that might provide a clue. The payment to Daniel Carroll for hire of Negro Tom could be matched with plantation records listing an enslaved carpenter named Tom. An entry for a hire of 5 Negro men might be tied, through other documents, to specific individuals in the area known to have masonry or carpentry skills. Slowly, painstakingly, first names gained trades, locations, and fragments of biography. As the picture sharpened, it became clear that enslaved workers had done almost every type of job required to build the house. They quarried and hauled stone, cut timber, fired bricks, mixed mortar, and carried out the relentless heavy labor that any large construction project demands. But the research also exposed something else. This was not only brute force work. Some enslaved men brought high levels of skill. There were enslaved carpenters, bricklayers, and stonemasons whose craftsmanship matched that of free artisans. Figures like Philip Reed, an enslaved foundry worker who would later play a key role in casting the Statue of Freedom for the Capitol Dome, stood for a wider group of highly trained enslaved craftsmen whose talents were indispensable to grand building projects, even as the law denied them basic personhood. The records also hinted at the human cost behind the stone and plaster. Construction in the 1790s was dangerous for anyone, but enslaved workers faced the same risks with fewer protections. A free laborer injured on the job might walk away, demand different conditions, or refuse further work. An enslaved man had no such options. He was expected to keep working until he could not. The account books sometimes mentioned payments to slaveholders for workers who died or were permanently disabled, compensation for damaged property, not recognition of a life lost. How many men were killed by falling stone, crippled by collapsing scaffolding, or sickened by brutal conditions around the muddy building site will never be fully known. If an injury did not affect the slaveholder's finances, it often never appeared in writing at all. Researchers also found that the White House's reliance on enslaved labor did not end when the last scaffolding came down. Throughout the antebellum period, enslaved workers kept the building functioning day to day. They cooked in its kitchens, tended fires and lamps, worked in the gardens and stables, and served in the household itself. Presidents from slaveholding states brought enslaved servants with them to Washington, adding another layer of contradiction to the place. Human beings were bought, owned, and ordered about inside the official home of a republic that claimed liberty as its founding value. Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, and others conducted the business of the presidency while being personally attended by people they legally owned. As this research filtered into public awareness, it began to change how the White House talked about its own past. In 2016, after years of work by historians, descendants, and civil rights advocates, Michelle Obama famously reminded the country that the White House had been built by slaves. For some, hearing that truth spoken aloud from the East Room podium was jarring, even controversial. But it matched what the archives had been saying for decades. In the years that followed, official tours more directly acknowledged enslaved workers' roles. Exhibits and publications started to include their stories alongside those of presidents and first ladies. A commemorative marker was installed to honor the enslaved laborers who helped construct the house, making their presence visible in a way earlier generations had refused to do. Even now, the work is far from finished. Many names are gone forever. Many stories can only be guessed at from scattered evidence. But the ongoing effort to bring these people back into the narrative is more than an academic project. It is a necessary reckoning with what the White House truly represents. Not just American ideals of democracy and equality, but also the long, painful distance between those ideals and the realities lived by the men and women whose unpaid labor helped raise its walls. The recovery of these hidden histories brings us, finally, to the question of what the White House represents in the 21st century. Not what it was intended to symbolize, but what it actually embodies when we examine its full, complicated story. The White House functions simultaneously as three distinct entities, each with its own requirements and contradictions. It is first a museum, a historic structure preserving 2 centuries of American presidential history, visited by more than 1 million tourists annually, who come to glimpse the rooms where decisions of global consequence have been made. It is, second, a working office building where the business of executive governance continues daily, with staff navigating between priceless antiques and computer networks, between ceremonial spaces and functional work areas. And it is, third, an actual home where the first family attempts to maintain some semblance of private life under the most public circumstances imaginable. Yet beyond these functional roles, the building serves as a mirror, reflecting America's deepest contradictions back at itself. Its history of construction encapsulates the founding paradox of the United States, a nation proclaiming universal human rights whilst practicing systematic human bondage. The building was designed to embody Republican virtue, yet it was raised by workers denied the most basic freedoms that Republic claimed to protect. This is not an abstract historical irony, but a concrete reality embedded in the building's very stones. Stones cut, hauled, and set by hands that belonged to men who could be bought and sold. The commemorations and acknowledgments that have emerged in recent years represent important steps toward historical honesty, but they cannot resolve the fundamental tension. We cannot change who laid the first stones, or under what conditions they labored. We cannot retroactively grant freedom to the enslaved workers whose sweat soaked into the building's foundations. What we can control, however, is how we tell their story going forward. Whether we continue to erase their contributions in favor of a sanitized narrative of founding fathers